Yeah, it's like, yeah. It really is. They're not, I don't know. Yes. Yeah. There were sex before too. Yeah. Yeah. That's so odd. Yeah. I know. Even last year, though. HR was something like that. So because I was before, like nothing to before, but yeah, this is relevant. Oh, it was super stressful because now my class is up and like and love and process as well. Um, yeah, it's not the attending, you don't want to say watch the part. Yeah, yeah, they're like such that actually all the time. I know the wax actually the fun part yeah, so I think they wanted to like I think was the comparison like a very common big, but then like it's still this university. No.
In front of the.
Yeah.
Which one comes out best?
But I think we're, that's good news to take. Yeah, it's they're talking yeah, yeah, doing organization. Yeah. Now he's sort of working smaller. Very small. Not just.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, actually, it's yeah,
Oh. It works. Anyway, hello everybody. Okay, who comes from Denmark? Who comes from a country outside of Europe? God. Look at that. Keep your hand. That's great. Who comes from the EU countries? Who comes from Britain? I'm sorry, that is the horrible. So I was trying to be, I didn't want to talk about Brexit. Anyway, so we've got an idea. There you go, idea. Well, we'll find out later exactly where it will come from. Anyway, this is the first session and of organisation in certain worlds. And I'll give a bit of background about that in a minute. And in also, very shortly, these other people, Søren, who is, you'll find out, he knows about the building, he knows about the community, he knows where this is all going. In fact, is the CEO of this foundation that we'll hear about in a minute. This is Anke, we'll second. And that's Christian, who's been the great connector that we're actually in this building and having our event here rather than negative about universities, rather than in the university. Yeah. And I think we'll find out the spirit of this place is really relatively relaxing, informal, and so on. Now, one of the things I just thought I'd mention is how did it all come about? That Anke and I are co-chairs of this research network, which may seem slightly counterintuitive for those who know me, but it was really a coincidence and serendipity. Tamsin, who's at the back there, who you know, who runs with Philip, the Common Ground Research Networks. I happened to bring them because I'd been at an event that they'd organised, and my friend and this event about videos, she kept on saying, ask Tamsin. I thought, it's great. So he's doing nothing, it seems, and someone else is doing the organising. And this is very interesting. So I asked him, well, what's the business model? Anyway, I ran up, and why it was relevant to me is some of you will know that I had this idea about creative bureaucracy, an oxymoron, I know. And I always felt our Creative Bureaucracy Festival was great at some levels, 2,000 people run. They talk about innovations in organisations, largely public sector organisations. But it's all a bit, fast. You don't really have a detailed discussion. So it always hankering after something, let's call it a research network, where you could think of it and be more reflective. So when I ran Philip, he said, I've got a problem with our organisational research network called Organisation Studies. Will you take it over? I said, God, I'm not a researcher in that traditional sense, but I know someone who is. Then the Anke, who is incredibly well informed about the processes of public innovation, design, and lots of other things. So I said, I tried to lure her into this way, and she broadly said yes. So we started this network, and he said, but only under certain conditions. A, that it changes its name, I become organisation in that certain world, and B, that the way it communicates to the outside world should be much broader than you normally associate with networks to do research. So yes, we will enable you to publish books, academic books, articles, but we also want blogs, videos, interviews, graphic novels, different ways of communicating that spread much more widely and attract a far greater greater audience. Because my son ran for 5 years something called The Conversation, which takes academic knowledge and with 50 journalists tries to promote it. And I know a bit about statistics and who reads what. And it might be 12 people read an article and stuff, and really want it to be 100 or 1,000 times more. So our ambition is high, and I don't know if we can fulfill it. That's a different story. Now, whilst today we may be talking a bit of the focus on public innovation, our notion of organisation, of course, includes philanthropy. So Søren will talk about that in a minute. It includes NGOs, private businesses, and Jeff, who's there, make sure you speak to him occasionally, gave a great talk yesterday about the way, private organisations have changed over time, and the public sector learned from it, and so on. So our scope is broad, although just this session over the next few days may not be that broad. So there are 4 points out today. So the first one is our ambit, our scope is broad, is wide. Secondly, I can't read my own writing, so it doesn't matter. Third, I've already mentioned before, is there's a hell of a lot of information that we've already got, content that we can put onto the repository. I'll just mention and put my hand towards Christian, who's written a lot of books which we can upload. Jeff done fantastic work, which we again can upload, so has Anke. And so we'll do that. So now I will hand over to you, that's all right, just to elaborate it a bit. And then we'll ask Søren, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Charles, and welcome everyone to the inaugural conference of the New Research Focus. Just like Charles did, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a political scientist by training, and I am very much an academic. I'm heading in Germany, a small university in Germany. I'm heading what's called the Transformation Lab. It's a new organization that was set up transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary. And although I'm a scientist very much working on government, working on organization for the complexities that we encounter today, my work in this transformation lab, as head of the transformation lab, is also thinking about what is the role of universities today in a world where we seem to do our own research. We are very much within the ivory tower often. But we probably should do other things. And we probably shouldn't be beyond that much more than we do most of the time. So the idea for the Organizing Research Network was really trying to think about what it means for academia to become much more transdisciplinary, particularly in organizations. What does it mean for people working on organizational research, people working on public innovation, researchers, it is an interdisciplinary field, to work with practitioners. And so what we decided to do is we want to open the research network, not just for many disciplines, for academia, but also for practitioners, people like you two, like yourself, like you, Charles, who are coming from the practice of public innovation. And people who are coming from the grassroots, who are doing organizational work, self-governance, who are effectively activists. All of these different spheres are doing work on organizations, and organizing, and we want to acknowledge that, and that's part of the new direction for the research network. And I think you said everything already. We want to slightly structure what we're doing here, opening up for new audiences, but also for new forms of communication, new ways of communicating, the kind of research that we're doing as academics, kind of work that is being done in practice, which is often extremely rigorous, both in organizations, and at the grassroots. And I think that's pretty much it from the more academic side. And maybe I'll hand back to you, Charles, So that you can pass on.
Yeah, I'll pass on the baton in a second. I mean, just emphasising that point that I made about blending together the knowledge of practitioners, researchers, and activists. Whenever we talked about this in the outside world, I think people said, yes, that was needed a long time ago. Thank God we're doing it. One final point I want to make, which is in praise of taxing the entity, which is when we publish books through the network or anything that we're publishing, it's much more cost effective than you would have in normal academic work or other work. And that's why, to some extent, this question of accessibility is also important. So now I want to hand over to the man who sorry, I didn't mean that, sir. But could you just tell us a bit about the building, a bit about this community, and also you've been quite a bit of an innovator yourself as a philanthropy, trying to rethink their role and so on. We'd love to hear about that.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your coming here. We're very proud of showing up. So I'm talk about first of all, my name is Søren. I'm the CEO of the foundation created on the back. We have a lot of these kind of foundations throughout Europe. So our money comes from running the city. Sales, CEO. And now we have our endowment, and exactly on that. So one of our mission here in life, our mission is to make system change. Our mission is to provide change. And we have moved the vision throughout population. We have moved it from one called version 1.0. Now we are going to 4.0 and now explain a little bit about that. If we just jump forward until say 6-7 years ago, we were looking into ourselves. We were actually the leaders of the beats and not ourselves. So we made a peak point analysis. And unfortunately, it wasn't as good as we expected. And one of the major problems we could see was that giving grants for years like that, it doesn't work. It's too risky. So you have to be working much. And you have to involve yourself in order to make change. So when we did this pain point analysis, we realized we had to become much closer to the people we were supposed to develop together. And then at that time it was the idea of community that actually came into our mind. Unfortunately enough, Corona came, and then we could sit at Zoom or at Teams and visit the communities all over. So we visited more than 50 communities in order to figure out what was the things that were the necessity in order to make a community work and what was the use of those. And when we got to that point, we thought, well, maybe we have to rethink this. So I took the big speech note. Then we called him the report. And this speech was cast when I was looking about what happens sometimes, right? And how foundation position. I played that before. They didn't get any spreadsheets, they didn't get any material at all. We were only giving this. So that was because we wanted them not to concentrate on paper, not to concentrate on the road, they should concentrate on what the goal that we were in. So they had 3 hours to discuss this, and they were discussing. But at the end of it, they say, we want to create this community. We want to create a house which can actually have this community. We have to say, well, we don't know shit about how to do it. We don't know how much it costs, but now we know where to land. And there's an old Chinese saying that don't know what beach to land at. But now we knew where to land. So then we have to figure out. And then what we did was that we hired six, talking about what should community be like, what should concept be. When we had programmed that, we put out market found space. And then we made an architectural competition. And the idea was to create community, but also at the same time use the idea of creating the community was to create what we call the electronic community. So we have a lot of tools in our toolbox. One of them is of course grants, but we have a lot of tools. Solve this community and the creation of community, that's a tool as well. So when we then got the position of the architects, so then we choose this. The reason why we did, one of the things we have been putting up was that this should be the most sustainable transformation of the building ever. So that was the one. But sustainability is not just something about CO2 emissions. It's also something. It's also about agriculture. So when we're putting all that up, then we start doing the building, and we transform the way that these contracts of how we are transforming buildings, changing the ways that the contractors. We have made a lot of experience. So the whole building is now and some tangible thing that you feel and look how you really change. If you go to the room in which you sit, this used to be toilets. We have to take why do that? But we have to include people. What use we have to pass also if it's a necessity. Not a necessity, why should we? With all these hacks, we created this building, and I can say that as a German architectural review with March said that the most spoken about architecture and building of the development is this building and something that the architect. And we also was shown that the department, so it's about transformation, not only of the building, but transformation of the mindset when you start up doing things. And that's also how we run. And we actually yesterday published a new organization. That's our 4.0. Just to talk a little bit about that, we used to have a very high organization with silos, arts, social affairs, and HR. And even though they were working good, they were working within it. And they were not working together. So now we have been merging. We have merged that into one huge team of people working with so that's the organization. One and the other organization. That's what we call a circle. So we have been creating circles for each of the group. The whole idea is to take our way, be authority, and not stop. So we, in order to enhance their way of working, we're creating these self-regulating circles so they can take decisions. So on the ballot. As you know, I'm an old school, and for me, I think I got that free. Normally, you are as a school, you go to charge, and you know what's going on. And we make it very common. Now it's scary. Now that we're giving our way to start. But as I said, we announced it yesterday. Hopefully it's not a success. It is a way to try to change also the way the foundation works. Because in a foundation, you have a board, and the board make decisions. But they very often make decisions next month later than. Because the organization and putting ideas and then putting the board to make decisions. I would like to have a board with 6 months before. So how do we do that when we still have rules of governance, there's a lot of legislation about how to run the company like ours, we do also run companies. So how do we make our board able to make decisions? See, that's yeah. If you go to this building and you go to the other side of the building, you will see a laboratory for the future. And in there we work with two group with the college group. And we have actually used that for the board. How to figure out how to take the system and how we do it. And what, and what we're decided on is that we have to have these governance. But we take the 1 hour and for 1 hour maybe 2 hours, and we take the teams 1 or 2 days before. So when it comes to work, we can discuss futures foresight. We can discuss development. We can discuss where we want to be, rather than always. So when the board is able to set that, then the conversation works. And then we have to move decision making, not in the board, not in the management, but it's. And that's what we try. So it's actually all the way from the board, all the way down from the conversation that this. We had Landry, we had the FIA conference, the FIA that the European discussion, conversation of nations. And we had a meeting in Copenhagen with that. When we talked about this, I have to say that I have to go to the foundation. So we hope that we front runners. Of course, it's dangerous because if you run risk. But I must say, no matter what company you run risk, the whole idea of running risk is to take risk, and you have assumptions on which you take the risk. If you get risk, you have to run risk. So what we have done is now try to, we know that fair chance, but when we are experimenting, then that failure is also, because then we can rule out that relationship. So for us, here in the people knowledge, we have 3 words that goes through all our work. That's experimenting, learning, and sharing. So with this building, which we have changed now, we do not have enough. Makes sense. But if people like it and do it, then of course that's quite another way to make it. So for us, we had very much not scaling out, but changing the basis. That's why we just show up. Community is a system of now 35 books, more than 20 people within it. It's a community for America. So we have created a manifesto. If you see the people outside the lines, some text on the back. That text, that's the manifesto. So if you are a member of this organization, you have to sign this. And every year you will come up with some. And if not, you're delivering, you'll be kicked. So the whole idea, we should create radical transportation together. In the beginning, we thought that we should force people to work together. That's not. So what we have learned now is that we should create the environment and then do the nudging people to work. We already now see that. We are actually a lot of and I can say that what we're bringing for 5,000 is we're trying to do a Danish version of just to show that it's Danish version of Facebook groups. In Denmark, more than was the population is all NGOs, all sports organizations, they more or less have groups in it. And that is, of course, run on the data. If we look at what, how much money we are giving and how much power we give from society to read that video. So now we have to try to English version that should be together with other versions for our work. This should be a community code platform, and it's started up by the finance by Sing Foundation to get started, but together with government. So we are actually able to take back all the stuff that we're together, give them away, and then actually making sure that it's not done with the use for the wrong purposes. And then we are actually trying to create a Danish society owned by the members of that. We call it Tita, not Beta, but Tita. So every day you become Tita, and it's going to be owned by all the members. So that's one of the results. That was a short.
That would really concern. I mean, there are so many things that one could say about that. One of the things I just want to give a fact in relation to your circularity is that 95% of this building, the materials have been recycled. They're not sort of, bought from I don't know wherever else. And so it is the most circular building in Denmark, and it really is interesting when you walk around just to look closely at things like the doors of the toilets and the stairs. Just anyway, have a good, sensory experience. So that meta thing is something else I must say. The counter meta, thank you so much. And now, we've got a group that just come in. Now I'm going to hand over to Christian. Christian, I'm not going to give you a whole backstory, but there are three things I want to point out if you don't mind. One is Christian used to run MindLab, which was probably the first public innovation agency in the world. Then he ran the Danish Design Centre, did all sorts of things, experiments, and thinking how you do things. And now you've got your own organisation, which has an interesting phrase, which is called the Transition Collective. Anyway, can you tell us a bit about some of the things that happened yesterday?
Yes, so hello everyone, and also welcome to Søren's building and a little bit of my building as well, being part of the community, proud card-carrying member of the community. So when we started thinking about this conference, we also thought about why not do a event or an early event as masterclass, and we ran that masterclass for the last 3-4 hours yesterday and the day before. For about 30 people, also from all over the world, 20 different countries, with a headline on institutionalizing for impact. And a little bit, as Søren was illustrating, how do you begin to build and embed impact, societal change institutionally in different ways? What does that even mean? And so we explored that, and we actually started and kicked off our exploration with an dinner keynote from Søren's colleague Jesper Christiansen, who's the head of learning within this community here within the People Foundation, to share how to work in a strategic, explicit, intentional way with organizational learning, and as Søren said, make your explicit as you design intervention, try to enact societal change. So that was a kickoff for us early. Then we had a structure of the conversations moving from a framing, which actually Jeff Morgan down here was giving on expanding our institutional options. So when we look at the world of institutions, largely the institutions that we see around us were built in the 20th century, if not before. I know Jeff has also been doing work on monasteries. Monasteries were built a little bit before that. And the question was is whether we are aware of the different institutional forms and models that we could design to serve today's needs and the needs of the future, and how do we actually sort of create a much more of an open set of options, not only necessarily for building entirely new institutions, but also for redesigning existing ones. You should also say that the backdrop for this masterclass was a partnership between Institute of Architecture Lab that Jeff Morgan is part of, and Demos Helsinki, which is a think tank based in can-do tech based in Helsinki, in Finland, and the Transition Collective that I am co-founder of. So we as a partnership saw the opportunity to have worked on the opportunity to reimagine institutions for quite a while. Then we had a conversation chaired by Anke, which was about ungovernability and how we've arrived at a place where increasingly we see a world in which governing is not impossible and it's very, very challenging. That's not a new idea. It's an idea that arose throughout especially the 1970s forward, as far as I understood Anke's contributions. But if you look at just something like the UK the last couple of days, I've been following the BBC's covers. It's like watching a crime scene, right? Looking at what's going on in the UK government, and you hear the BBC saying, "Well, this is Britain becoming ungovernable," right? And you can say the same about other countries. There's a lot of cities and regions around the world. Are we losing the capability of governing? A lot of my work has been about human-centered design, a lot about bringing service design and design policy into public institutions and reimagining how we interact with citizens and communities from the vantage point of institutions. But increasingly, I've come to realize that to govern, we really need to have to rethink how we do things together in common. So the take that example from Søren of like imagining a Facebook that's seen much more as a commons and much more as a societal resource rather than as a private business model, as extractive business model, is one example of reimagining an institution that serves society's needs rather than just shareholders' needs or founders' needs. So I think the governability question raises a few questions about how we actually organize collaboration, which leads me to missions, which was a big topic and a big theme yesterday. We had a interactive session with Demis Helsinki and Anke Gruendel, who's publishing a new PhD coming this September on the experience from 4 European countries on building missions for societal change, France, Netherlands, UK, and Denmark as case examples. And I shared some of the work I've been involved in for the last many years, studying the Danish Design Center, building missions on mental health in young people, missions around circular economy and transformation of our business sector here in Denmark, and also missions on ethics in digitization. Some of the work we also collaborated with the People Foundation around sharing missions as an approach. Before we then ended our day yesterday in the evening with the question of humility and what we call humble governance, which basically to say institutions, organizations that are able to collaborate, able to co-create with a wider ecosystem of actors that are enacting change, probably need to be more humble. On the one side, more ambitious, visionary, at the same time, more humble that we cannot do it alone. And that opens up a space that for more collaboration. I want to end just with a couple of points for those of you not necessarily so familiar with missions or the notion of pinpointing long-term societal impacts, long-term futures that we want to create and shape and make happen, and harness truly the collective imagination of many different actors. So recently I worked with a large city, the Nordics, with the mayor, with the city leadership team, and they were trying to address the question of excluded youth for that city. And the city council had actually already decided on the strategy for how to address the question of excluded young people. I can say, by the way, that the moment the problem really became prevalent for the city was when young people in one of the more ethnically diverse neighborhoods in the city started throwing hand grenades. And that's when they realized there's probably an issue here. Now, the way the city council addressed this problem when they started on this process 2 years ago was to do a lot of paperwork, make some decisions, and then adopt a strategy. And then when I asked the mayor and his team, did you speak with young people? Did you speak with communities? Did you speak with sports clubs? Did you speak with education institutions? Did you speak with employers? Did you speak with cultural institutions? The answer was no, 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 and no. And then, of course, the question becomes, do we think that we can create change, long-term, deep, lasting change, transform a large, complex city where young people feel that they belong, they feel that they are, it's the vision of the city, by the way, the strategy is the best place in the world to move to live, and to have a job and education. That's the ambition. And of course, you cannot do that if you do not engage, involve, co-create. So the question of imagining what does a city look like that really does what it needs to do has to, of course, take place. It's collective imagination with people, with young people. Point one. Point two, when we then imagine another world, we do it together, then the question becomes, how do we then take that energy, that motivation, that directionality, and transform it into action? And how do we bring not just different actors together, but different skills, different capabilities, different resources? Most societies, and people have written books about this, have an abundance of resources if they look different. Because resources are not just money, they're not just institutions, they are people, communities, people in the communities that they know, and so on and so on. That's the second point. And the third point, learn that as we begin to act more collectively, to try to enact change for the long term, but through implementation, smaller things we can do, small interventions, how do we then learn? How do we take a strategic approach to learning, continual approach to learning? And I have yet to come across, and I work as an advisor with organizations all over the United Nations, World Health Organization, national governments, city governments, NGOs, Plan to Peace. And if you ask most of them, not people who say actually done it, but most of them, they will say they don't know how they learn, where they learn, who learns, what processes are involved in that. It's not very explicit, it's not structured, there's no process at all. So when we have festivities like this one, we talk about learning organizations, not a new idea, I know that. Most people do not have good access. So we need to, when we work with missions to create learning, it's not even within organizations, but it's across ecosystems of actors where we make our assumptions explicit, understand why we experiment in a portfolio of experimentation, why we, how we act, how we observe what's going on, how we find impact insights and data that's something about what's changing, and how we put those insights into the next inspiration of action. So that's what we discussed the last 24 hours. Jakob was here right now for a little debate with a debate about missions. I was positive. Jakob was the grumpy old man who had some security. But I think we're right in a nice place now. My judgment. So I'll round off by saying that I feel I'm sort of geared up for today, for the dialogue with you throughout today and tomorrow. And we're really looking forward to co-host this global community with, I think, a really good question. How do we organize in uncertain times? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now, for the moment, it's open to you. Do you want to ask any of these folks here any question or throw stuff into the air? That would be great. And if you don't ask a question, I'm just going to move the microphone to someone and force them to ask a question. So, great, you've got something. Right. Obviously, just say who you are. Better.
Josie Medina. I live in a company called R500, but I go to university in South Texas with a second master's degree. I thank you all for your information and all provided us with your thoughts. I had a question for Christian, that city that you were working with. Did they talk to any linguists that were specialists in the slang of the local youth and ethnic communities?
Well, again, unfortunately, I didn't really talk to too many people at once. And what's fascinating is that the question becomes also, when you then have a policy that's adopted by your city council in a democratic process, you realize that the city democracy, so to speak, is just in a sense one silo, but it's made its decision. What do you then do? So what I've been observing is like, how do you struggle with having a policy that's really not focused on value? And you then roll it back, you start over, but you say, oh, that's too bad, you better just keep that running and then move on to another domain where we have a better chance of actually doing true cooperation, true engagement, maybe get the linguists in. And I think that's the most likely strategy that this people have to deploy. It's like, we're going to have to give up on that one because it's too far down the road. The board has made its decision, right? We didn't cross the board the right way. We need to do it in a different way. Of course, we want cities, democratic institutions, or national governments to have a say, but we need to, before they have a say, I think, or in a process with them, really co-create. And I think that's in many ways also what this foundation has found a way to do.
Was anyone interested in the way Sarah talked about his philanthropic organization, which is obviously not the traditional one? Was anyone impressed by it, or did you were impressed? Ask him a question.
Yeah, I was actually interested in wondering about your.
Say who you are.
Oh, sorry, I'm Rosa Cordovans, I'm from the African Side of the Cities, University of Cape Town. And I wanted to know about your mission and your manifesto, basically, as a tool for what's it mean to be, in a way, like how strict are you and what happens if if it will fall on the manifesto or do something that isn't in line with it, and who then is the entity that sanctions anything?
Well, very good question. When we created society, our community, that was, as I said, on the back of getting closer to people, to develop. When you, as a foundation, go into a money, very often then so thought that the good idea of creating this was also to democratize decision making. We couldn't go away from that. We had the money, but we thought we gotta get out, get on. Try to be in eyesight with people who should develop together. So the way that we have created it here, created an association, which is the community. And that association have members from all over the countries. And it's the all of that, and that's not us, and I'm not on the board, but it's all of that association decides who become members and who gets kicked out. We give money to the community because we think it's a philosophical vehicle for us to create radical transformation. So when I talk to Mike, they of course ask, how do you make sure that we create this? Of course, by turning on or off the water, I can make sure some of it. But we have to put up some rules and follow this planning. That's why we create the manifesto. And everybody has to sign up. So before you can become a member, you have a process, meeting the municipal, and meeting the people there, so they believe that you really want to. Then you say who decides who's getting up. Well, we have created a rule saying that you're not allowed to stay in positions. What I have so some move by themselves if they realize that they have or give to the community as much as they should, or we give them in. So far it has not been a necessity to keep them up, but it has been a necessity. They stop them, you have to get your answer. So we will do it the quiet way. Well, I have to say that when you've been putting on movement, they are nothing worse without or so I think that
Can I just ask you, you said you had a few weeks ago with Philae, the organisation of philanthropies, had a meeting, I don't know, you said 900 people or so. Were you really an exception there, or was, and if you are an exception, does that relate to the fact you mentioned earlier, to me at least, that you are relatively small? I mean, for us here, you were big, because you were still big, not so much. Did people think of you as a pioneer? Did some of the bigger philanthropies ask, how do you do it? Or do you think it's only possible to be a pioneer if you are massive, etc., etc.?
well, I think it's 12 years ago I worked together with the Rocket Financial Advisors about creating theory foundations. And that is not that there's one single theory how to make a foundation. It's actually that you can be the foundation in a lot of different ways. The other thing is that you have to make certain why you do these different decisions and how you would like to. So foundations represent plurality rather than dominant one. So if we take the whole scope of foundations, yes, we are probably in that, and others are in that. As I said, you can't apply us once. But the most foundations you find, and they give either yes or, and you don't get told why. You just get it. We are on the other side. So, I would like to make a huge slide. Some of my staff, communications team said I'm not allowed to put it there. I would have a huge sign there at the building saying, if you come here to apply for money, go away. But if you come here because you want to co-create solutions for the most important problems for our society. So that's the way we do it. And Philae made a report 2 years ago, together with the Institute for Future Studies, about which foundation find things. We're about 21.
That's interesting. So what we see already is that we've talked about one type of entity, philanthropies, and how they are trying to respond to an uncertain world. Anke didn't really have enough time to say what she actually does. She runs something called the transformation. That sounds alluring, but what the hell does that mean? You know, thank you.
Sure, we don't know yet. There are multiple reasons why we don't know yet. Just started setting up the lab, started in November last year, so it's really quite fresh. And then we don't really know what transformation is because people don't. Transformations are many things. One of the things that we want to do in the transformation lab as academics, I am very much, coming from the more abstract theory part of academia, is trained as a political theorist, and immediately rejecting political theory being too abstract. For me, the question really is, well, what do we do? What is ultimately transformation? And I think the lab, the way it's structured right now, it is a core part of the university's own transformation. And as many of you probably know, universities are some of the most sclerotic organizations that exist today, currently, and that's true particularly for UC. It is impossible to get anything done. And the transformation lab, in a way, is a way to subvert that a little bit. Of course, we have to stick with the university's rules and regulations, but we also connect multiple interdisciplinary research foci at the university where I work in Leuphana University, South Hamburg. We research democratic change, so democratic resilience. We have one research arm that is organization in times of crisis, which is very much organization studies. We have one research arm that researches climate futures in individual cultures. It's a humanities project. We have a research arm on sustainable companies. And we have one on ecological regeneration, all of which are broadly thinking about what transformation are. What we are seeing is that transformations are very different things depending on where you look. And the same definition doesn't hold in different spaces of practice, but also in different academic spaces. We have just different definitions. And at the same time, there is such a thing now emerging as transformation research. And in some way, in practice, the term transformation has been replacing a much older term, which is progress. At the same time, transformation is being able to be captured by all kinds of different ideas and notions. So it's much more capacious, but at the same time can be filled by transformative practices that maybe we don't really want. So a huge part of this notion of transformation, what we do within the transformation lab, is thinking about what consultation has to do with defining what transformation is and how to think about it. And in a way, the lab itself allows us the space, gives us the space to think a bit more conceptually what we need to do when we call something transformation, and what the term does when we call something transformation, and what kind of theories, what kind of conceptions, what kind of research methods, what kind of empirical foci we are putting onto the term transformation, and how new really conceptual framing that is capacious, that is multiple, that isn't just one thing, allows us to understand what transformations are today and what they should be as well.
Thank you. We wanted to say something. Can I now reject it just to forewarn you on a bit of mine?
So Anke's comment maybe, two things. One is that using these terms, transformation, which the foundation here also does something. So when I came in and we designed Mind Lab, the government innovation team in Denmark, inside multiple ministries in the heart of Copenhagen here, I needed to hire. And I thought to myself, what's the job at? What does it look like? Hiring somebody into an innovation role in government. And the headline we wrote was, "Do you want to transform government from the inside?" Question mark. And this was a job ad in the national newspaper at a time when the economy here in this country was booming. It was 2007, right before the financial crisis. I don't know if you remember, but that's when things were just red hot. And we got 600 applications. And most of the 600 applications said, "This is exactly the job that I want. This speaks to me. This is what I want." Now, 400 of them were not relevant. 100 of them were lunatics. But the 100 were pretty relevant, and then five that were absolutely stellar. One of them is active in the room, actually, just for the and so I think what these words do, they become attractors to someone who have ambition or vision or drive, energy to do something, and that has a lot of energy itself. I would also say that having a term that nobody really understands can actually be an advantage, because the ambiguity and the underspecification need to create a space for something new can happen. So actually, I don't think it's a problem. We can't totally nail down what transformation means, or transition means, or even innovation means, because that ambiguity then can actually be quite powerful.
It's interesting you say that. A long time ago, we know the word creative is completely overused. But at some point, I was working in one of the major London boroughs, and they started advertising and saying that they were creative. The amount of people they suddenly got to apply was a completely different order of magnitude, whether it's good or bad. People know that word so confused. Can I just pivot a bit, because we talked a bit about the way philanthropies might change. We had a discussion yesterday with John Cook and Jeff, and you wrote a very interesting Substack article about universities and some. Could you just mention a few highlights of that, just to sort of cover these different institutions that we're going to cover over the next 2 days? Do you mind? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask two questions.
Oh, to ask the question
Well,
first.
When it's on the university, if you're interested, it's a rather long piece. Look at the analogies between where universities are now, phenomenally powerful, 50,000 of them, a trillion turnover, 260 million students, and where monasteries were 5 very powerful centers of learning, but actually on the brink of collapse. So if you're interested, read that piece. There are two questions I wanted to ask. One is about philanthropy. We had we have an annual gathering in the UK called the Foundation, which I have to speak at the largest one. They spend about 20 billion euro a year, which sounds like a lot of money. And they're very interested in transformation and systems and so on. But it's way under 1% of GDP. They're far less powerful than governments and big businesses and others. So there's a kind of, was the sort of fantasy of thinking that they could transform whole systems. And would it even be good if they could, given they're not accountable in any way? So I just would be interested in your perspective on what's the appropriate balance of humility and arrogance. If some of us do need arrogance to change, but it seems to be particularly tricky for growth. And then there's a second question about co-creation, which is very low, and everyone in this room will have views on it. If you're dealing with something where lived experience is really important, like the details of care or how a neighborhood works, co-creation is obvious. But there are lots and lots of things in a very complex society which need very specialized technical expertise. I don't want to co-create my surgery machines or the detailed design of energy management. Don't talk tariff policies or money policy and so on. So again, how do you think about navigating where is co-creation really important and where is it absolutely? Sorry, that's not what you want to say.
You want to respond? Anyone can in the audience also respond, by the way, but please do. Well,
I'm gonna just take a lead here.
you're going to take a lead
Yeah,
off,
because-
yeah.
Because this is very much central to my research. I think these kind of questions, and I do a lot of genealogical work, so I'm trying to think about the historical precursors for where we are today. How we're thinking about organizations today, how we're thinking about transformation today, and how we're thinking about governmental change. And that is, in a way, that is not a new question, right? These kinds of questions about what knowledge is important to make decisions, particularly binding decisions, collectively binding decisions that governments are making. Those questions have been around for really quite a while. It's much more than 50 years at this point and way before. But in governmental spaces, these kinds of questions have been asked for well more than half a century. And the question is, well, first, what kinds of knowledge are there out there, and who holds them, and then how do we get to those knowledges, right? What are the procedures by which we need to generate those knowledges, tap into that knowledge, right? In a way, line it, right? And then what are the ways to get that knowledge into decision-making processes? And there are many different proposals that have developed over the years. One of which is design, actually, which generates lived experience, as you pointed out, Jeff, and then brings it into new ways that are genuinely different. But the question today, I think that is really interesting, is exactly what you raised, right? How do we balance lived experience and technical expertise? And I think my answer would be, well, technical expertise is not at all going away, but it is getting a different status. It is now no longer this only holder of truth, the only generator of truth in governmental decision-making processes. But in a way, it's been demoted somewhat to one of the many forms of knowledge that are important to make decisions. And then question, well, how do we decide which decisions should be based on scientific and technical expertise and what shouldn't? And that's in a way, that's a political and democratic question coming from a political scientist. That's going to be my answer. And I think that's a question both of organization, of how do we think about organizing, right, like our governments, our institutions around missions, or perhaps not. And it's a question of procedures, and it's a question of how do we build democratic societies going forward. and how we change our institutions to accommodate that without losing sight of the importance of technical expertise. And I think that most of us in the room will say, probably all of us, that we absolutely need technical expertise, scientific expertise. I think without that, we can't manage most of the problems that we're facing. At the same time, that scientific expertise shouldn't crowd out the rich experience of people who are experiencing. So that is a thing that Christian wanted to.
What's the logical sequence, Christian?
It's in the cooperation after the first, then I think we jump to philanthropy also. Yeah. So on co-creation, thanks, Jeff. I mean, we did a bit of a debate yesterday, Jeff and me, so now we're a little bit back to debate space here. So obviously we want to choose the processes that kind of fit the problem space. But I think we often underestimate how different knowledge forms and different disciplines are needed to contribute to better problem solving. And so even surgery, as mentioned, Jeff, you say, well, we don't really need cooperation, I think just doctors do what they do the best. I worked there when I was in my lab. We did a longer study together with the National Hospital in Copenhagen and the Heart Clinic. And the Heart Clinic does pretty important surgery because they take people's lives, they put in ICDs, put in different kind of technology in people, and if you ask people if they are happy, if you ask the user satisfaction, it turns out that the user satisfaction at the Heart Clinic in Copenhagen is massive. It's like 99% thumbs up. But actually, when we looked at it with the 2 weeks of anthropological study, it turned out that actually the user experience was horrible. In terms of how people were prepared for surgery, how they were communicated to. And when we then started to embody, say, cooperation, we found out that you need to speak to not only the doctors, but have nurses involved, the people who are people around involved, communication skills involved, leadership involved. You could also imagine that there are suppliers, technology companies, and others that supply these surgery and these operation theaters involved. And so actually to transform surgery to have better prepared patients, to do the post-surgical care, even have patients that were not, that are getting their sleep. It turned out we need to talk to the cleaning company. Why do we have to talk to the cleaning company in the national hospital? Well, because they were the ones making sure that things were hygienic, and they were not hygienic. They were the ones who made sure that things were ready for surgery. So co-creation there meant that there were many professional domains beyond the clinicians you needed to engage to actually have a transformative, meaningful, and also effectful experience. So I think that co-creation can take many forms, but I do think we live in a world where it's very hard to see, you can't build an iPhone just with engineers, you can't do a youth exclusion policy just with the city council, you probably can't run a philanthropy from the inside out without engaging with communities. And so I do think that we need to have maybe a more advanced understanding of the forms that cooperation can take, not only being, citizen participation.
Well, I think it's the question about the philanthropy's role, but Mark Kramer wrote an article saying that philanthropy has failed because especially the large US philanthropists have been spending a lot of money trying to change society without government and without municipalities, without the local areas. I think that's dead on right. But I also do believe to a certain extent that it's more in that sense, that it's a pan-European problem. When we work very closely. We know that we are not politicians. We are very political. That's we got hopeless. And we're not politicians. So we work together with politicians, and just to name one example, we create what we call policy labs. These policy labs, we gather NGOs, universities, trade unions, or whatever we can serve. And then we together with this have a discussion about where do we really want these to together to create change. So we put these people into a closed room and take them there for several months, discuss how would we decide upon to create the best solution to people out there. Not in the public, but in the people. And when we come up with all the organizations within, we put that to the list. They form it into them. And then they send this information out. And everybody's acting positive. And it's unanimous on the action. So here we as philanthropists are creating a catalytic space, not for our own good, but for the good of society and the government context. So I think what we have to do much more on these co-creations, which I mean, we have changed ground forest also, farming also. And we are creating, we're going to change this water about 20 years before that. So we have experimented a lot about how we do in order to. This material we now deliver to the government, and they will put up a new legislation on how. So I think as a foundation, if we respect that we are not politics and we are not democratic, but if we respect that and we work together with the and government, then we can do it. And I would say that more than 75% of our is done with title government. But it's not about us sending more money. It's trying to take what we are best at, together with what they are best at. And I actually do think to some extent that we are to be with them.
You're saying, I'll go then. It's a bit like acupuncture, you were saying, like that. So you're saying that 1% is more than 1%. Far away, yes.
Hi. So first off, my name is Diana. I'm from the Southern United States. Kind of wanted to kind of go back and look again, and I apologize if I misquote anyone here. My hearing's not the best. But recall toward the beginning mentioning that sort of the kind of 4-year grant model not being a long enough time horizon to affect meaningful change, and then kind of want to explore the tension between that idea and then the idea of, say, limiting people in the foundation to 6 years if you want that turnover of fresh new ideas. That's sort of my first aspect of the question is how do you resolve that tension between kind of being able to move fast and have new ideas versus wanting to have that long-term impact. And second idea I kind of wanted to explore was going back to this idea of the manifesto and getting community buy-in. So I'm a university professor. I, as a professor, don't have the luxury of having philanthropy money to be able to decide who is in my community or not. So in sort of organizations where you don't have that ability to sort of brute force everyone into marching to the beat of the same drum, how do you still build that sort of collaborative nature with the group that you have rather than the group that you curated?
Well, it's a question maybe some I would say the first. When we do that, typical that you have an NGO apply because they have an idea. And you will soon realize that after 2 years, they are looking about how to do the next summer. Because otherwise they have to be spot. So it's like a hamster that they're always trying to see where they can get financing of their stuff rather than solving problems. Why need the stuff? So I think we have to go the other way. We have to figure out what are the major issues that, well, for example, homelessness. Even though that we are probably one of the most wealthy societies, homeless people, we actually saw that the homelessness of the youth, that increased with 100% every second year. That was horrible. And we were spending a heck of a lot. So what we said was, well, we should be spending that, maybe we should create another fund. And that's it. And we realized that there was a lot of organizations working within this country. And we were also giving grants for them. But they were talking about each other, but not with each other. So we had to create quite a new system for this to change. And that takes time. In the beginning we said, now we're looking at a 10-year. Then after 5 years, now we're looking at a 30-year. Now we can see that now it's time. I'm not saying it's involved with but what I'm saying is problems are deep. We have probably solved 75% of all major problems, but we still have 25%. A lot of these problems are big. That's why we created what we call the Institute of Property. That's an institute that created like a Trojan horse that we can drag into the Ministry of Treasury and to see whether we can think. Because I think it was Einstein's that the definition of insanity, that is to do the same thing over and over and expect another result. So we have to redo things, and I think that we have a road, but we have to go long term, and maybe 10 years ago. So, and I think philanthropy has been very short-sighted because it's very difficult to change a board foundation. Because people they love dedicated money. And but not put on to all this. So I think by changing that, also changes from I'm going to say two NGOs that I don't care about NGOs. I care a lot about people they're supposed to know. But if the NGOs become more looking much more into themselves rather than to people they're supposed to know, then something wrong. And I think these 4-year periods create that in real budget.
Yeah, just in general, look up the Institute. Just an interesting entity. I mean, we talked about words, transformation of words, how words resonate. When I first heard about it, you see people somewhere, I thought, wow, this is sort of it. Anyway, look it up.
And yet, which comes is also one of those really old terms that comes from the late 60s and actually from the German mathematician was Gödel.
Yeah.
Point taken. And it's one of those things that have a really long legacy.
Yeah, and maybe just on the question of reconciling along from the short term perspective part of it as well. That's one of the things we discussed yesterday, this masterclass, really those tensions, right, with the paradoxes. And well, in a sense, we need both that thing. Now, I don't think it was Einstein, but it was F. Scott Fitzgerald, the American author, who said that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in your mind at the same time without going crazy. And so increasingly we see these tensions, short-term action, get things done, long-term, patient, visionary, foresight as well, wisdom, say. And so in a sense, the question becomes, what does an organization look like? This is, I guess, a question for a conference on organizing uncertain worlds. What does an organization look like that is comfortable with navigating and being in those tensions and can do that intelligently?
Right. My name is Barbara Lochinsky. I'm a defense scientist with the Department of National Defense in Canada, with the Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you. It was a great opportunity to be here today. What we're doing is looking at participatory action research. A lot of you have been talking about it actually in terms of creating greater community stakeholder engagement, and I'll be talking about it tomorrow. So I wanted to know, can you give us some key takeaways or key ideas or principles or foundational elements that we can run with in order for us to be a little bit more engaged with the communities that we are talking with, or trying to create a much more better holistic way ahead together.
That answer is all, could be from anyone. You start.
Yeah, I'm gonna start on that, then I'm gonna come to you too, because you're actually action. I'm also like talking to walkers and more. I think participatory action research as a methodological framework already gives you a lot of what you're supposed to do. And there are excellent ethnographic field studies that are built on participatory action research. Just off the top of my head, there's a wonderful book that by Mariana Mora, who's from the University of Texas. She did a long ethnographic participatory action research study for a dissertation years ago on the Southeastern communities in Mexico. And because it is so fraught within the Mexican state, and as a organization, a grassroots organization, you should look that up. It gives you an excellent framework on how to engage these particularly communities that do not really engage with official politics, right? The communities that refuse usually to participate in politics, and they project right on the basis of the legacy of colonialism in the Mexican state. So I recommend that absolutely. It's a wonderful study about how to do that practically. And over to you two.
Well, as I said, when we created this community, we talked with a bunch of people on how what makes a community work and what doesn't. And it's some of it is very practical. But one thing we've done is that we've created a community team. We have a community team, and Josephine is just sitting beside him. Member of it, I think there's 7 or 8 people. And that's because this co-creation doesn't come nice. We have to make sure that we create space. When we created the housing review, we gotta have somebody, what people, we have what we call this hangout, like, we're sitting at long tables. Why are we not sitting at short square tables like that? That's because they don't. Then tomorrow you sit same 4 people again. So if you're sitting at a long table, you sit. We have 2 court stations in the building. They're created so it takes quite a while to think. So you have to stand in line. When you're standing in line, you're talking next to. So we are creating these to make people talk. We thought that we could make meeting what people should talk about. Mainly the problem. They stand by they want more than that. And then suddenly an idea. And then they put it into it. And we'll actually see this is very creative. So as a community creator, I think you have to do things like that. Not force people to go create, make the surroundings and the environment. So, but it's cost. It doesn't come fast. That was something that we learned from over and over. These places where you didn't have people working with it did that.
And maybe building on that question of sort of coming from a large organization. I mean, defense is not only large, it's also growing. Lots of investments going. Also in Denmark, we're purchasing another year. We're preparing for I don't know what. And so my experience running the mandate there was build a government team that is designed to do citizen engagement in public policy making and service design. And that means building a specialized team, specialized units that can do engagement. And finding out what that means itself took a while. mixing a blend of ethnography and anthropology and sociology sort of disciplines, with design disciplines, and with policy, somebody understanding government and systems, and what's even the context in which you're trying to invite in different types of voices and stakeholders. And then getting the fits or the impact organization. If you can build a specialized team, and I know you had that in Canada too. I worked for a while with Horizons Canada, which is the foresight team of the federal government in Canada. And remember how they were like, well, we do these really, really nice foresight reports for our colleagues in government, and it turns out nobody reads them. And then you can ask yourself, well, is that because they're like 150-page reports and people are like, they're busy doing something else? So how do you think about the formats, the engagements, the interactions within the wider organizational context? How do you help the wider organizational context if possible for the specialized team to actually function and perform? And we did that for 8 years, a bit longer before someone ended up, after I left, terminating the team. But I think these teams need to be, and this is maybe why, by the way, terminated, that these teams need to be quite adaptive and quite amenable to what's actually priorities of the organization. You don't follow the flow with what's needed, let's say defense priorities, policy priorities, but stick to some kind of whatever agenda you have, then it's not going to work, right? But I think there is a question of it. There's a huge global community of innovation teams and labs, lots of research, OECD has a whole specialized center sometimes that you can learn from, in fact, how to it.
Yeah, the Landry was to counter our atmospheres. There were sort of preconditions but many things happen. Has anyone else got any of that? John Corporate, yes.
My name's John. University of East Anglia, County Corporate. No, that's fine. We get used to it. The question I had, it's a question about the response, insofar as organisation answer implies a question about how organisations are to change. Is the assumption that the way in which organisations change best in uncertain worlds, they change best by becoming more democratic? And if they change best by becoming more democratic, does that mean that they also need to become, and this picks up on an earlier point, more translational? I'm asking the question because it's one that's really whizzing around in my head at the moment. I haven't got an answer to it.
Have you got an answer?
I do not have an answer, and I don't think that there's a single answer to this, right? Yes, first of all, right, democratic isn't one thing. There are many forms of democracy, and there are organized. When we're thinking about democracy, right, electoral, representative democracy, but there are very, very much many other models. There's majority democracy, there's radical democracy. There are many models of democracy. Even the idea of deliberative democracy, of representative democracy isn't just one thing. There are many aspects. And so democratic theorists have started to shift towards a system model of democracy, and not all parts of the system are necessarily democratic, which just makes sense, right? And I think that speaks a way of thinking about organization, about procedures, about politics, about democracy that is really multiple, that has many different aspects, it has many different perspectives. And I think that in a way, that's kind of what we need to be working towards. Not finding a better model, but finding many models that replace the singular model, right? I think that Christian was speaking about missions. Yesterday, you showed many different forms of institutions that function all very differently. Rather than finding the one best way, what you need is maybe sort of many of those coming together and then a question. Of course, when it comes to how do we coordinate, how do we collaborate between these institutions, what I mentioned. And that's a very difficult question. I do not have an answer, but that would be my response.
So I think it's an excellent question, and I think in Denmark we are seeing some interesting signs. There's America touring around this country right now. He's from Berkeley, academic, and wrote a book called Nordic Capitalism. And I think in Nordic capitalism, this American just is arguing that the Nordics have some incredibly competitive companies, in part because they're democratic, in different ways. I mean, they're foundation-owned, some are cooperatively run, and they tend to be able to take long-term have long thinking, because they don't respond to immediate shareholders. They are been born with a bigger societal purpose than only making a profit and so on. So there's something around what's going on in this part of the world that we might learn from. I think one of the insights, I started out saying a little bit about our masterclass from the last 24 hours. And one of the conclusions that I heard was that organizations that are actually fit for a certain world are learning organizations. I know it's not a new idea, but bringing that back to democracy, in my mind, reminds me a little bit of the Danish academic lawyer Alf Ross, passed away a long time ago. But Alf Ross, on the back of the Second World War, made the argument that democracy is conversation. I think the American flag is saying more or less the same thing. Judy and others. And so if democracy is a form of conversation, ongoing conversation on how to improve things, this almost sounds like a very organization actually. And I do think that organizations that are fit for an uncertain world are ones that put a premium on more conversation, more inquiry, more questioning, more humility, while knowing which coast to navigate to. And so maybe to Andy's point that democracy brings things, in my mind, without conversation, I don't think there is a democracy. You can't even have good elections without conversation before, during, and after. And that's what kind of attack these days in a lot of places. So maybe the conversational organizations are maybe something we can do.
Well, just to follow a little bit of that line, I think that one of the reasons why the Scandinavian area is very interesting, that's trust. We are born with trust to each other, and that governs us. And I think that when we meet something that just not live up to us, we will then put on controls and then rules. And the way that these huge companies are very successful, that's not the rules and controls, that's trust. So I think it's very important that we continue. But you can only have trust if you believe in each other and you are educated. So I think that the grand discussion is very important. Of course, you can't run a huge company just by one. But you gotta have some business about even though that you're right. But you have to do it, so you have to take it seriously. And I think that the problems are taken very, very seriously. And I think that's one of the reasons.
Yeah. Anyone else? Just because I'm almost aware of time in general. Coffee breaks, all this stuff I'm aware of in my mind. Please fire away.
Hi, Ian. So this is, again, not a question I expect anyone in this room to have an answer to, but wanted to go back and expound a little bit on the idea that you brought up earlier about connecting with communities that resist being connected with for one reason or another, and just wanted to again just put the perspective on the table and at the risk of creating a false equivalency here. That, say, for example, you can say myself as an openly transgender person living in the American South, that I might have some very significant reservations about trying to participate in public life due to the very real threat of physical violence. And it's one thing to try to have a conversation, but if there's a significant possibility that your interlocutor may respond to your conversation with a gun, then how do you have that conversation?
Totally, and I think that, right, the queer community is the only community that experience, there are many different communities that have historically been so marginalized that why would they collaborate with me, right? And I think that part of collaboration is something for us, a really big question, has to include refusal. If your interlocutor isn't going to talk to you, that's part of a collaborative process. And one is really hard to us. hard for us to accept the feel these researchers, right, when the people we want to work with refuse to connect. That's part of it. That is absolutely part of the process. And then that's a question for us as, right, capability academics. Well, how do we deal with that? If it's just sort of like, you know, helicoptering into communities and studying. But and in a way, the reorganization of the Organization Studies Network is a bit of an attempt to try to create something different, that is collaborative, genuinely collaborative, where we have stakes in practice, both in practice and government innovation, public sector innovation, but also with grassroots organization. I understand why activism is happening to activism. Finding a way to connect activism might be a lot harder because, you know, you guys are an open community. That's awesome. We want to do that. We want to interact with you. But there are other practices, other communities that are being trying to convince them, you know, we're not just here to exploit, to really collaborate. I guess refusal is part of that. And I don't really have a good answer for you other than, you know, we as people who hold, you know, up to 10 seconds, we hold a lot of power. And it's a question of us, how should we, right, engage in ways that are open, that are genuinely collaborative, that do not just exploit. And that's, this has been an ongoing issue for the way that we are changing and thinking about this issue, so we have to change dramatically. I know that Laura wants to say something.
I mean, and maybe just something to possible to continue about this few days is, I think this idea of care and also caring organizations, and I think, you know, many governments have not actually done a great job in caring honestly. But I think how you honors and rise with humility and resolution. And you know, there's a lot of their reparations, right? So I think there's a whole lot to talk about. Also, if we engage with the experience, outside of Europe and further south.
Just because we're slowly going towards the break, but I think it would be quite interesting to feel a sense of what the other parts of the event is about. So anyone who just wants to 1 minute max, just say what they're going to be doing in whatever workshop or whatever. Ready, steady, go. Who's going to start? Someone. Okay, just 1 minute. Off you go. Tell me what you're going to talk about. I'm not got the clock on, but I have my line.
Yeah, I'm actually not going to be talking about anything, but I just wanted to make a few comments. My name is Sonia. I am from Surrey, which is a city close to Vancouver, Canada, and I'm a social worker, and I wear a few different hats. Just wanted to firstly comment on just some wonderful things that she has said, especially short-term grants don't work, have worked in a nonprofit. There's a constant fear of, well, our grants going to run out, so what do we do? Buildings, like I just love again that idea of why change things if they're working, why do we need to put up the paint and all those things. Circular conversations, I love that idea as well, as long as we're not going around in circles, because quite often I've been in those things as well. So a few things just around, you know, the social worker, critical thinking and all that. Policy groups, I think that's a great idea. What I've seen happen is that governments will find people who are aligned with them to sit on policy groups. I've been in municipal settings, provincial settings, where you try and as long as you're agreeing with what they're doing, so they've got this policy group which looks wonderful, but a lot of times it's really echoing what the government is saying. And then the piece around governments, they run on their 4 or 5 year cycles. It's for them now, a lot of times it's about re-election. It's really not about transformation. So that becomes challenging. As you said quite often, you know, democratically elected governments and being in North America, I think, and I mean, I'm originally from India, so how democratic are those elections is also a big question mark. And there was one more thing. Just a question that you may not be able to answer, is that piece around giving decision making to staff. I sit on a couple of social work boards, one is a North American board, and for me too, having been a frontline worker for years, is about how do you make sure that you're hearing the voices from the grassroots, so that you're not really, making those decisions, which ultimately somebody has to make those decisions, so the board does, but how do you ensure that those voices are being heard? And sometimes it becomes a logistical issue. And lastly, I'll just echo so much that it's so much about building trust, where right now a lot of voters are disengaged because they don't trust the government, and a lot of workers are disengaged because they do the work, but the people that are higher up that actually make decisions, there's not a lot of trust there. So I've packed a lot into, and I've taken away.
No, that's fine. You're packing in very brief answers, sorry, because I want to hear from a couple of people what they're going to say and do later.
Well, one act that we use sometimes is that because it's very difficult to have a discussion about the future of the future. So what we do is that we take an empty chair, put into the room, and that represents the future. So we try to see whether that chair can make something. Well, so for us, it's not about, it's about bringing the future into. So we're able to make decisions, reach. And about these groups, I agree, government will put groups together that solve that their purpose, but it's actually us being implemented and.
Yeah. Okay, someone somewhere here is correct. You get a prize.
What is it?
I don't know. Oh, I'll give you a book.
I would be increased personally. I belong to a video institution here, changed for about 500 years. It's called the University of Cincinnati. And our keep the same dimensions of monastic cells, which is hilarious. Tomorrow, my colleague and I are going to be talking about transformational change within this medical institution, trying to get people to think about changing how they teach, and they're very specific and very desperate. Mechanical concerns, but the generation of knowledge of the medieval institution, because textbooks are a huge problem. We want to talk about the textbooks are including the creation of the knowledge and how we can change publishing materials and AI and help teachers be more innovative.
Great, looking forward to that. Someone here? Is anyone here doing anything? Come on, you are. Okay, say something briefly. We'll just get.
Hi, good morning, I'm Bob Derringer, my colleague, Dr. Bank. We're here talking about an innovative cultural big program, which is, well, it is providing tools for employee meetings in a county entity, which is unheard of during the workday in California, in the US actually. We're also, we've been studying it for the last 10 years now, and we're looking at organizational change within to see if we can get the organizational culture, is the organizational culture responding to what we're focused on wellness, and this is with the behavioral health organization.
Okay, I want two more. Yeah, you're one of them. Yes, hello, say who you are.
I'm Dr. Bason, the lecturer at St. New York, the first in that. And living in a kind of a post-feminist or anti-feminist environment in America, especially in the States, and it's quite fascinating. And so my work is looking at utilizing the strategy and tool of feminism, and how do we code things in organizations to attract funders, and to appeal to parents and a variety of participants that might not identify or value feminist ideologies, and how organizations kind of utilize this kind of self-feminism way to create a culture of care and ethic of care, as was mentioned before,
and to, and how, a small organization is not just a big organization. Experience.
Thank you. Someone here, anyone here going to say something? All right, John, what are you going to do?
I'm going to be talking about the medieval institution of the university of Bason and what the factors are that are driving the crisis as it's perceived, at least in a number of countries. So that's the thing today.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to say something? Please do. Say who you are. Say.
Of course, without a doubt. My name is Landry and I'm from Sheffield in the UK. And I'm going to be focusing today around how politics pressures, but from a charity sector perspective, and some of the challenges which are external, led by minority women-led organisation. That's quite an interesting one because for them to sustain and survive as a private sector organisation, they need to have a good relationship externally with the funders versus having a good relationship internally to make sure that when you do get funding, the outcomes are actually met. It's quite an interesting one. However, separate from that, I am an academic at Coventry University and lead on resource management, change and leadership aspects, which I think in the current economic climate for all of us is a real challenge.
Thank you very much. And now, Nancy, will you please go to my front? So,
practical things to say in the session before we get some coffee. So first of all, thank you to the four of you for this morning. I've been standing at the back of the room listening to you, and it's sort of become apparent throughout the session that this is actually the perfect space for this conference. It's a real place to like live the ideas that we're talking about, and hopefully test them out a little bit and adapt. Okay, practical things. If you haven't got your name notes and came in during that session, come here with me after this. We're going to have coffee now, and then we've got talking circles. And so in the world of organizations differently, this is not your typical academic conference. We're going to talking circles. What is a talking circle? We're going to pick a room based on the theme that you're interested in, the room 1 or room 2. And what we're going to do is form a circle and talk. Tell us who you are, why you picked that room, what you're presenting on. Much like we did just a little bit now, but in more detail. So join for that. All the sessions are up on the 3rd floor. We need a key card to get up there. So we're going to have to go as a group. We're going to have to organise collectively to get upstairs to the 3rd floor. If you need help, let me know. We have our Magic Scholars training sessions. We have a new platform. So CG Scholar is a new platform. This is the first time we run this conference with our new platform. There are over 60, between 60 and 70 people here in person. There's almost the same number of people participating online. Hello, online people watching this video. So go ahead and look at their sessions under the asynchronous tab if you need helpful guidance there. There's a lot of, I think we saw like 80 pieces of digital media uploaded and a lot to see there. So don't miss out on those presentations there. Conference series tonight. If you're not signed up or if you're not sure if you signed up, let me know. And with that, I'm sure there's something else up. But thank you all and thank you all.
did you? Yeah, obviously thank these folks here. Yeah, but before we get back to them later, if you don't mind, I'm very lost. Sorry about this. But just as heading out to the 3rd floor, presumably at some point you or somebody to say, "Ready, steady, we're going."
Yes.
I want to take time.
Caffeinated, and we'll go up at 5 minutes before the session starts.
So that is what size time?
Usually 5 minutes.
Because we're in Danish time here, which is the size.
Yes, I know. I'm Australian. I'm just 11:05.
11:05. Right. And thanks to Christian, Søren, and Anke. Thank you so much.
I didn't notice it. They got their
Organization